This is the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast with your hosts, Jaco and Christine Stephen.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast with myself, Jaco and Christine Stephen. And we're honored to have our, returning guest. We're really discriminating against the others. We have a preferred guest, Dr. Lucas Klein. Welcome, Lucas, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure as always. So I'm excited to dig into this final expose of the Holmes Report and tell people about what's going on in the general psychotherapy field, academia, and in psychoanalysis specifically.
So we're concluding our series of discussions on the Holmes Report, and our listeners can look at our previous episodes, Psychoanalysis Gone Rogue, that is what we called them, the Holmes Report. So I'm going to discuss Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 contains the many, many tables and many, many questions, and very, very limited and uncharitable interpretations of these tables. So I'm going to, even to our listeners, it might be difficult to follow, and I'm going to structure it as comfortably as possible for our listeners because they won't have the tables in front of them, just to give them an impression of the trend and the Holmes Commission's approach in analyzing this data. So they start this chapter with a paragraph that goes like this. The murder of George Floyd was a wake-up call that led to nationwide self-scrutiny, suggesting that something very powerful must be operating that runs counter to and undermines the commitment to equity and diversity that our institutions publicly espouse. These powerful forces have come to be conceptualized as institutional, structural, or systemic racism, indicating that they are embedded deep within the structure of an organization in its group unconscious. Those forces are mobilized to entrench the existing order and its relations of power and privilege. Systemic racism opposes our conscious drive towards greater equity, inclusiveness, and diversity. Once deployed, the forces of institutional racism exert a decisive influence on thought and feeling and impel us to action. So I think it is important here to notice how they frame the introduction. So they already set our mind to a specific way of looking at these things, merely through the lens of this ghost, the thing that's everywhere and nowhere, namely structural and systemic racism. And they check all the necessary boxes of talking points, referring to systemic racism, the thing that's everywhere and nowhere, referring to things such as police brutality. Later in this chapter, they mention something about that. And there's also a reference to police brutality as George Floyd was killed within that context. And then also those nice terms that several of these posh institutions ran into trouble with now recently: diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And then as we proceed, we will see that they do the same thing, namely to artificially categorize people into homogeneous groups of all white versus BIPOC. So that is the stage that they set for approaching their statistics. You're welcome to say anything if you feel like it.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in here. A little bit of backstory for listeners and viewers. Since last time I was on the podcast discussing this report, it's been a little while. I had submitted a criticism to the Holmes Commission through the APSA listserv, which the two of you nicely posted to CTA. And it was essentially saying that there is no objective criteria here used. And, this is a shoddy project. And I went through the specifics as to why. And since then, it really lit the field up a bit for a while on the listserv, as is expected. But they also had their methodologist pen a response basically to me. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. Have you? Okay. I have it in front of me. I try not to look at it, but this is the time. He says, just as an aeronautical scientist operates with an assumption that gravity exists and thus does not begin an aeronautical study by proving the existence of gravity, the Holmes Commission acknowledged its understanding that systemic racism was ordinary. He goes on to say that he brings himself to respond to the criticisms of the Holmes Commission methodology against his better nature, because even to engage with criticisms like mine and others is to essentially question the unquestionable knowledge, the new knowledge that the Holmes Commission presented. Now, a friend of ours, John Mills, who I respect and we all respect greatly, wrote a very cutting and precise takedown of this. I was thankful that he took up that mantle, and you can find that. I'll post it through my own podcast, Real Clear, today. And they are essentially saying in their methods response to me and others that you cannot question the methods of the newly generated knowledge, that white people are standing in or white supremacy, I believe, is quoted here and elsewhere, unless I'm mistaken, is standing in the way of new knowledge by focusing on methods. You see, knowledge is to be taken as valid because people express it, right? This is what we call testimonial epistemology. That's what the entire Holmes Commission report is. It's testimonial epistemology. That should scare people. There is no such thing as knowing anything by testimony. That's why we have studies. That's how out of bounds this whole project is.
That's such important context to frame it in, Lucas. So thank you for jumping in on that, because I think that gives a real good framework as to why this doesn't have any legs to stand on.
They also found a methodologist who specializes in systemic racism. They did not seek out an impartial methodologist who doesn't care about their project, which they should have. They sought out a methodologist who deeply cares about the content. He even wrote a book, and in his rebuttal to me, he started off by saying, as I explore in my most recent book, Systemic Racism and Educational Measurement. So you publish on this very topic. The Holmes Commission selected you out of thousands of methodologists who they could have selected. It's interesting that you specialize in this and care about it deeply as a subtopic of methods, and you happened to find that the Holmes Commission was correct in their initial statements, and then you make a response that says they already decided that they were correct, that there is systemic racism everywhere. Newly generated knowledge that challenges the status quo is called into question through critique of the methodology and methods employed to generate that new knowledge, rather than through direct contestation of that knowledge. Brings himself to say, the white racial frame, ... One such influence uses methodology and methods as tools to control what qualifies as legitimate knowledge and what does not. I have a pointed question for this man. Why are you a methodologist? If knowledge is to be taken on face value because someone exclaims it, why use methods? Why did you get the degree that you got, if not to examine the way in which we acquire knowledge? You don't question gravity. Sure, I think we're at the point post-Newtonian that we don't question the presence of gravity. But as a colleague of mine put it very well in a private exchange, physicists spend a lot of time studying the effects of gravity on objects passing through it.
What if he used the metaphor of someone in a particular space where there might be gravity, where there might not be gravity, okay? But suppose the person was made of a certain material, surrounded by other forms of material, where there might be electromagnetic forces interfering with its movement. Not only that, what if in that space there were different drafts of winds blowing through? because that would be a much more comprehensive, much more equivalent analogy to human relationships. There are so many different competing dynamics among human relationships. We cannot just conclude that human relationships only consist of the presence or the absence of something like gravity or racism, or the presence or the absence of something like a motivation for power alone, as opposed to motivation for, say, affiliation or achievement, etc. So, but it just betrays the person's one-track mindedness that even in their analogy, they limit themselves to considering alternative possible explanations to this.
Yes, so racism explains everything. That is
Right.
That is the tenet of wokeism. Race and gender now explain everything. So it's remarkably ironic. It does not pass the common sense test. And to even check if it does pass the common sense test, it is itself evidence of racism.
It says there, as far as our own profession, psychoanalysis, is concerned, there are at least two observations that suggest we may have a difficulty with institutional racism. Now listen to this. First is the fact that despite our conscious attempts at inclusiveness, our profession remains overwhelmingly white. In other words, unequal outcomes only has one explanation, and that is unfair discrimination. We know, I mean, it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind, right? Secondly, there are consistent reports that mainstream psychoanalysts have difficulty taking seriously and working with BIPOC experiences of systemic racism without a reference. So they say this without reference. So isn't it also striking how unconscious forces, how white people are the only victims of unconscious forces, but BIPOC people couldn't be? Right?
Oh, it's interesting how you put that, victims of unconscious forces. They would say perpetrators and colluders.
Perpetrators. Right?
Yes, I was going to say perpetrator as well.
You said this is testimonial epistemology. That's I would say a variation or a type of standpoint epistemology, namely classifying our societies in dominant groups and subordinate groups, prioritizing the opinion of the subordinate groups, assuming that subordinate groups couldn't possibly misjudge intentions and processes around them, and also that all subordinate groups think alike. And should you find certain groups within those subordinate groups that do not necessarily agree with maybe an overall sentiment among the vast array of subordinate groups, you repudiate the opinions of those smaller groups, which creates circularity. So there is already a preemptive anticipation of what the subordinate groups are supposed to think, and outliers we simply reject. So this is just one of the flaws of standpoint epistemology. And also, like we said, they don't test against any alternative explanations.
No, and the methodologist says at some point near the end of his response that there is an issue of multiplicity, meaning that they used a very small group of people for multiple comparisons, and that is a serious methods flaw. He's right. I'm glad he acknowledged it. There is, I think, a good way of defining in part wokeism is the sacralization of either minority or perceived oppressed groups, the sacralization. And that's why we see this push to make the races epistemically distinct. It's a very scary thing to do. It's been tried before in human history. And as I wrote in my critique, the results have been catastrophic. But yes, you see movements like this try to sacralize minority groups and believe that whatever they say is in fact true at all times. And that's nothing short of religious. I might say it is also exquisitely ironic in the context of recent American history, relatively recent American history. Empiricism saves discrimination. I mean, it really corrects for it. It was not too long ago when Harvard was discriminating against Jews because they thought, well, Yes, you're smart enough to be at Harvard, of course, but you're just not quite Harvard kinds of people. That was the way that they excluded Jews. Well, what got Jews into Harvard? The SAT, right? It was the focus on objective measurements of competence and so forth. So objectivity and so forth. It is the saving grace of discrimination. It's the exact reason why it was imposed in the United States. Well, here's a further irony. My critique obviously focused on the absence of objectivity and any focus on proper quantitative methods and so forth. Got a backlash, a real frenzy of people responding to me as if simply pointing that out was itself racist. I couldn't believe myself today when I was prepping for this talk. And I found in chapter 4 the following. Key finding number 3. As was seen in admissions procedures, participants described a lack of reliance on objective data and lack of transparency in progression criteria, which may make it more likely for racial bias to play a role. I almost fell off my chair. This is Orwellian doublespeak. So one of the biggest problems is that APSA does not have enough objectivity in its admissions and progressions processes. And then I point out as a critique to their study, there's not enough objectivity involved in your study. And they say racist, racist for saying that. That is unbelievable of you. Meanwhile, they are reporting the very same thing as a proponent and problem of racism. This, you can't make this up. And this brings us to the question of why are we having this discussion? You cannot reason with people who are saturated in this ideology. The purpose of this discussion here is to reach people who are in training, who know that this stuff is nonsense, who are needing a voice, who are needing to believe and realize that their objections and concerns with what's happening right now in society are grounded, are based in reason. That's why we're having this discussion. It's the people watching the argument. It's not our opponents.
Precisely that. Our aim is not necessarily to convince the so-called opponents. Our aim is to inform the public, the spectators, and they need to apply their minds and they need to draw those conclusions.
And so they need that validation that they're not the ones that are crazy. I think that we read this stuff, we get submersed in it, and eventually you start to think I must be going crazy because of the nonsensical nature of it. So to have that extra validation that no, what you're seeing is actually nonsensical, and you are not the nonsensical person. What you are reading about and being forced to swallow is indeed full of error. And
Occam's razor. If something doesn't seem to make sense, it probably doesn't make sense.
Yes.
So they start by saying psychoanalytic candidates and faculty felt that when attention was drawn to issues involving race, racism, or white supremacy arising with institutions, they were not adequately dealt with. So that is where they start. BIPOC faculty felt more uncomfortable with the prospect of reporting racist incidents within the institute than their white counterparts. And then they refer to Table 1. But if you look at Table 1, so it's a Likert type scale that they use. They ask the questions such as, if you were to experience or witness an action you considered racist, how comfortable are you raising the issue with leadership in your institute? Very comfortable, somewhat uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable. And then they have the two columns, white and BIPOC. Now, from the white faculty, 51.6% felt very, very comfortable, 51.6%. BIPOC, 40.7%. Somewhat comfortable, white, 31.5%, BIPOC, 29.6%. Now, you can look at this and say 52% of white faculty felt very comfortable, and 41% BIPOC faculty felt very comfortable. How significant is that difference? 52% versus 41%.
And what was used to determine significance, right? Was it a Mann-Whitney-U? Was it a Driscoll-Wallace non-parametric test of difference? We don't know. They don't say. And I found it very interesting that even in his critique to methods problems in the report didn't spell out what the specific procedures were. Could you guys find anything? I couldn't.
No, we couldn't.
Have you ever seen a research project, by the way, a serious research project that does not list its statistics?
I've never seen something as flimsy as this. Okay, so, but if you take the comfortable, the very and the somewhat comfortable together, 83% of white faculty felt comfortable, 70.3% of BIPOC faculty felt comfortable or comfortable enough. What's the big deal? What's the big deal?
Yeah.
I mean, if psychoanalysis is so racist,
yes,
why would such a large proportion of them
discrepancy.
feel largely comfortable? Not only that, when the Holmes Commission talk about racism, let's be honest, they talk about white on black racism, right? They don't consider black on white racism to
be. Jaco, you're already way beyond the pivotal focal point for them. There is no such thing as anything other than white on other racism, because in their view, racism requires a power structure in order to be implemented.
Yes.
I can't believe you missed that Marxist hierarchical necessity.
But I need to point this out. If these psychoanalytic institutions are so racist, and if we think about racism as white on black racism, why are 83% of faculty comfortable with reporting racism if it implicates white people? Shouldn't be the other way around. If they're so racist, shouldn't they be so uncomfortable with reporting white on black racism? Should they be so blinded by their own denial, their own racism, that we would see the results skewed into the other direction?
Wonderful question.
Yeah. Similarly, they say BIPOC candidates felt more uncomfortable than white candidates in raising a racist incident with their instructors, supervisor, or analyst. I'm going to go into this again. Table 3. If you were to experience or witness an action you considered racist, how comfortable are you raising the issue with your analyst? So if we take the comfortable, very comfortable, and somewhat comfortable together, 96.1% of candidates were comfortable, white candidates were comfortable reporting white on black racism. What's so racist about them then?
Don't you understand? This is explained by Robin DiAngelo. They're overly eager to report. They're jumping the gun. They're trying to get past the struggle session. Don't you see, Jaco?
86.4% of BIPOC people were rather comfortable reporting it. Again, BIPOC people. So hang on. If that is the explanation, why would so many BIPOC people be so comfortable with reporting white on black racism if these institutions are so racist?
Does anyone else feel like this is a Babylon Bee episode?
Yes.
This is crazy.
Yes.
I mean, isn't it interesting?
That's the perfect analogy. Yes. The Babylon Bee.
The devil's in the details.
Yeah.
And that is why they skimmed over this.
We're drifting into sarcasm so implicitly and appropriately, because how else do you deal with this? It's a reasonable response style.
Yeah. Over half BIPOC candidates and about 20% more BIPOC candidates, 55%, than white candidates, 34%, had raised an issue with an instructor or leader at their institute. That's table 5. It continues saying, this suggests, now this is interesting. This suggests a feeling of greater exposure and vulnerability for BIPOC candidates during their training. You see the skewed interpretations got to be the victims. Confounding this question for candidates is the question of compulsion as opposed to free choice, as far as one's advisor, supervisor, or analyst is concerned. About 36% of BIPOC candidates were assigned a supervisor as compared to 13% of white candidates. Why do you guys think, do they consider this to be a problem?
I'm going to tell you the answer to the entire report right now. Okay. This is, and I'm not being cute about this. This is
Right.
literally the answer to your questions. It is the answer to every single question like this about every single one of their items. They are using comfort and psychological safety as items to compare across groups for equity on those items. They want to see intergroup equity on reported comfort. That's why they're doing this. I had scratched my head as like the same questions you have. Wait a second. If you really read this reasonably, it means that the vast majority of either person from any race is comfortable. Not having a problem at the institutes. But it is the difference in comfort between races that is their problem, that falls into the equity hierarchy. You have to have perfect, identical levels of comfort, right? That's Kendiism.
Yeah.
And if there's not identical levels of comfort, then you've got racism.
What they're implying then is that institutions need to be structured in such a way that a greater number of BIPOC people should feel comfortable in reporting these things.
Correct. You see how crazy this has gotten in society? It's no longer, first off, equity itself is a very questionable idea, obviously. But it started off hinging around material goods and measurable things. Like, I mean, the Marxist take on equity is obviously wealth. It's an acquisition of material good, of money, something tangible. They're actually moving into equity in psychological experiences. We are in a whole other realm of abstraction and social insanity at that point. If I'm to say, well, I feel 73% comfortable, just as a bizarre example, and Christine was to say, she feels around 67% comfortable right now, we might assume we don't have equity in our comfort levels because Yaku's white and I feel more comfortable because white.
That's right.
And Christine is she doesn't have that level of comfort. And there's an inequity between our levels of comfort, definitely because there's this.
Because I'm not white.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
that's how off we are in society right now.
But they still draw conclusions from perception. They draw conclusions on objective reality. So based on the differences in comfort, it's more uncomfortable for BIPOC people to report incidents of racism. And they conclude, therefore, that these institutions are too hostile towards BIPOC people. Why else would they be? What would they feel less comfortable than white people? Well, that may be a conclusion, but the other side of the coin is still, if we talk about systemic racism, and if differences in reporting reflects not only on institutions but also on these people participating, then there's got to be something said about the white people feeling more comfortable about reporting white on black racism. Trends need to be consistent, and we need to be able to take trends and compare them from different angles and notice consistency for us to draw consistent conclusions, such as, therefore, psychoanalysis is racist.
Don't you see, though, Jaco, the methodologist already responded to that way of engaging with the material. To question the methods and the trends and the consistency is itself racist. So I think you need to reflect on the way in which you are criticizing their knowledge.
Right.
Okay, that would be my
unquestionable.
Yes, that's right.
Unquestionable knowledge. BIPOC candidates were also 4 times more likely to be assigned an analyst and 2.5 times as likely to have felt uncomfortable with their analyst. But now listen, though the actual numbers of BIPOC candidates involved were small. I just want to give an idea of how small they were. So they make a big fuss about this. 4 times more likely to be assigned. 2.5 times as likely to feel uncomfortable. So we're talking about 12.4%.
Yes. Oh, I've got something here for
of
you.
BIPOC
Yes.
people feel uncomfortable versus 1.7% of white people feeling uncomfortable. Whereas 45% of BIPOC people feel comfortable. And about 70% of white people feeling comfortable. Very comfortable.
My neurons are overheating. The motherboard is melting. I have to say something here.
Go for it.
There was a section, I can't remember where in the report, that said the following, and you can find this in my City Journal piece that I published through the Manhattan Institute on the Holmes Commission. They said they did not have enough data to adequately talk about racism on the couch. And you're addressing the section issues to do with racism in the field, in the clinical field. So do you know what they did? They turned to the experience of commission members.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So just to put that in perspective for listeners, the study's authors decided they didn't have enough data, and rather than just leave that as it was and note it as a limitation of the project, they decided to ask themselves if they agreed with themselves. And it was a real page turner. And it turned out when you turn the page, they agreed with themselves. I didn't see that coming, but it did happen.
Not the B. This is not the B. This is real stuff. Psychoanalysts claiming to be on the side of mental health, right? From promoting themselves to be people who could be consulted so as to help them with their mental health.
Imagine talking that way to a patient. Imagine they turn that kind of imagine saying, hey, listen,
I'm stunned.
You don't know what's going on with your spouse, but you shouldn't. No, don't ask your spouse. Ask yourself. Ask just, and if you agree with yourself, you've probably got a point.
Because we know that unconscious dynamics couldn't possibly deceive you into wanting to agree with what you want to be true.
Of course.
No.
Right.
Because there's an ascendancy of the oracles in this case, the oracles who are writing this kind of thing, that they couldn't possibly be touched by the very same processes that they're saying contaminate every institution everywhere. They're exempt.
Something else. You're on page 56. Most white and BIPOC candidates reported feeling comfortable at the prospect of discussing race or racism with their advisor, supervisor, instructors, and fellow candidates. All right. Then it says, however, 67% of BIPOC candidates and 55% of white candidates indicated that they never or only once or twice discussed race with their supervisor. Now, and then they point us to table 13. The question says, how often is race or racism a topic discussed with your supervisors? Never, once or twice, regularly, and I don't know. The never percentage among whites is 10.2%. The never percentage among BIPOC people, 14%, right? Now, once or twice the percentage among whites, 45.2%. BIPOC, 53.5%. Once or twice. Regularly, now listen to this. Regularly, about a third of white people, 36.7%. And also about a third of BIPOC people, 30.2%. What is the problem here? Again, they want these two things to be identical.
Identical. Equity between perceived emotional experiences. And then if you go further, If you reduce further beyond that, now we're landing on what I would call the first factor of insanity in society right now, which is that I call it radical contextualism. And that is essentially that the internal emotional experience is to be taken as a completely veridical representation of external reality. That's why they're going for testimonial epistemology on the left.
But it's also addressing the context in such a way as to subject it in favor of an outcome that prioritizes the innocence of a victim group and the perpetration or the guilt of
yes, this is the fantasy of the purity of the oppressed.
So I get your point on radical contextualism. I just think it is trying to fish for necessary evidence so as to prioritize hypersubjectivity.
Well, that's pretty interesting. Christine, what do you think about this, having spent time in academia? Do you think that Jaco is more correct here, that there is a fishing and intention to present misdirection, versus what I believe is more likely the case, which is that these are true believers?
I think they're true believers. That's what I would say. From my, now that's just my experience having taught at one school in one program, being a BIPOC, quote unquote, which I never labeled myself as to begin with. And also the fact that we did have struggle sessions that were part of, you have these fishbowl conversations. All the white professors would sit around the room, and in the middle are all the BIPOC professors, and they would sit and talk about how the white professors have influenced and affected them in negative ways in all of these fashions and this and that. And you'd have the white professors sit there and listen. They were not allowed to speak up. They were not allowed to say anything in defense of or in support of this group or themselves, but they were forced to sit and listen. And this BIPOC group would sit there and get into the weeds on all of this. Their true belief is exactly what the Holmes Report is saying, that there is this structural, systemic, and it's impossible. This will never be resolved. The bigger issue, I think, on top of all of this being, just a quack, report and a quack way of thinking about life right now, but it's that there's no resolution. It's that there's no end to this. There's no way to actually end any of this systemic racism. It is so embedded, right, in our structure, in our system, that you cannot put an end to it. If you ask any of these people, what do we do to make it better? Their answer is there's nothing you can do to make it better. There's only something you can do to try to be an anti-racist, right? The answer is to be an anti-racist every single day. And that has to be the perpetrator. It has to be the white person. It has to be the person who's, perpetrating all of this hate onto everybody else. So they have to every day make some effort in order to end it. But there's really no point if there's no end in sight. It just doesn't exist. As long as human beings walk on this planet, there's no way that we're ever going to end these great divides. So it's a very hopeless, what's the point kind of feeling at the end of it all, which is why you see the depression that was starting to occur in classrooms. And you saw all of these students that were starting to get very depressed, very anxious, very, unable to complete their work. Some of it is that we had students that were very fragile, and that's the people that we were self-selecting for in the program. But some of it is that there was such a hopelessness about all of this that there was almost, why are we getting out of bed in the morning and coming to class? And what is the point of being involved in this profession at all, where we're here wanting to be of service to others? And the answer is there is no hope.
Whether you refer to it as hypercontextualism or hypersubjectivity, it is trying to achieve the same thing. Namely, there's a predetermined outcome.
Sure.
Victims are victims, and we decide who the victims are, and we will build your resentment. We will incite resentment.
Sure.
We know who the perpetrators are, and we will condemn you, and we will guilt trip you.
Yes.
And that is the type of hypersubjectivity I'm referring to. And if it requires us to twist and selectively fish for contextual factors in such a skew manner as to bring about this skew outcome, we will do that. One point condemning objectivity, in the next breath endorsing objectivity and criticizing the system for not being objective enough.
Yes.
So I think we're referring to the same thing, just from different
Yes,
angles.
I agree. I agree.
Well put, Jaco.
I mean,
Yes.
look, I have to say, I was approached by the psychology department at Loyola Marymount. It's out here in California. Maybe you've heard of it, Lucas. I don't know, but
Yes.
it's a Jesuit school. Okay, so they came to me and they said, we'd love for you to teach a couple courses, etc. And I said, okay, I'll be happy to do that. Under the requirement is that I'm not going to be using any critical social justice concepts in the classroom. My syllabus will not reflect any of that. The curriculum in the class will not reflect any of that. That is, what I'm bringing to the table. And how do you feel about that? And I wanted to be very open and honest about it before I decided to make a yes or no decision. This was a couple of years ago. Took them about 10 days to write me back, I'm sure, because their heads were blowing off with steam. They couldn't even think straight enough to respond right away. So after 10 days of self-soothing and calming down, and then whatever kind of conversations they must have had, I get a response that says, thank you, but no thank you. Within the signature of the email of the person, the president of the school, okay, the president of Loyola Marymount says, we believe in the objective reality here that the systemic racism exists. We're all a party to it. Either we're the white supremacists and we need to work on being anti-racist, or we're the oppressed and we are the victims of it, which means we are to be open to the reparations that we are deserved, that are headed our way. That essentially, that just tells you everything right there. There was nothing else to say. There's no comment to that.
The methodologist presented the exact same response in his response to the method's critiques, and I quote, "Systemic racism exists and is in operation at all times in ways that are both visible and invisible." Right there, you're in religious territory.
Yes.
Right. So how do you measure something that's invisible? Well, that's why they believe in measuring equity. Everything, even feelings, because the evil spirit of racism has descended upon us if there is a difference between groups in any way. So this is, it's a religious movement. There's no question.
Here in table 17, it says, for each statement, indicate your level of agreement. The field of psychoanalysis needs to increase focus on race, racism, and white supremacy. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. I have a question. Percentage-wise, how many or how much of the white contingency strongly agreed and agreed versus the BIPOC contingency? Percentage-wise. The question says the field of analysis needs to increase focus on race, racism, and white supremacy. Now, remember now, the white people are part of a system. So according to this doctrine, they're as racist as every other aspect of the white supremacist system.
So why ask them questions at all?
Fair enough. But I still want to hear from you guys what the percentage was. Do you think there would have been a difference between white people wanting psychoanalysis to focus more on race, racism, and white supremacy versus the BIPOC people? Do you think there would have been a difference?
A difference or a significant difference?
Yeah, that's the question.
Anyone? Take a guess.
Minimal, almost identical.
Would you expect that from racist whites?
Oh, from racist? No, of course. From racist whites, you would expect them to say we do not need to focus on that at all.
Of course, and that's what the assumption is, isn't it? These white people are racist, not so?
Yes.
What was the result, Jaco?
93.5% of white people, 93.5% of BIPOC people.
It's exactly the same.
It's exactly the same.
That's not a significant result, though. That's not really worth remarking on in the report very much, is it?
No,
I don't think we should talk about that.
No, not at all.
Okay. So when you look at the results in the tables, you also see a comparison in sentiments towards racism. Faculty sentiments towards racism versus candidates' sentiments towards racism. And you see a greater trend in radical racial awareness among candidates versus faculty. Now, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of people are actually being reeled into the field of psychoanalysis. If even BIPOC faculty are more relaxed about what they consider to be racist or not, whereas with candidates, we see a greater or a heightened radical awareness of racism or not, especially their sensitivity towards microaggressions. Candidates are being trained and are being induced into hyper-racial thinking. And this is problematic. This is what Volkan refers to as large group narcissistic regression.
The interview and the interview process and the process of choosing candidates to come into these programs select for that in particular. It's not so much about the skill set as it is about whether or not you can identify what a critical social justice concept means, a time when you've participated in institutionalized racism, or a time when you've been victimized by it. These are the actual questions that are asked in the interviews. Within the world of psychotherapy, we'll say, the umbrella that is psychotherapy, you know, you definitely have the arm over here that I'm talking about that did select for that in particular, for those candidates in particular. So that's part of what the decisions are being made for the people that are coming in. And I do want to go back and read this because I do think it's really very ballsy to actually put something like this in writing. LMU is dedicated to eradicating systemic racism and addressing the histories and systems of injustice perpetuated against POC, while also taking responsibility for our institutional complicity in the perpetuation of white supremacy. That is from the president of the school.
That's
and
wild.
Yes, and that is in writing, his statement. And that's, you know, what I wanted to kind of drive home is that
just wild.
That's a Jesuit school, which you wouldn't expect.
It used to be the case that when we brought up terms like racism and white supremacy, we meant that in a conscious sense.
Yes.
People who held the conscious belief
Yes.
in racial superiority and inferiority. I would say that focusing on that is a big enough challenge that when you expand the frontiers for measuring and adjudicating these matters to the unconscious, to the implicit, now you've got an impossible fight ahead of you. How on earth are you ever going to
This is why it doesn't end. That's exactly right. This is why it doesn't end. This is why it can't end. There is no end to this. This is why there's no solution.
You cannot state on one hand that racism is akin to implicit bias and is inherent to human nature, and then claim on the other hand that it can be corrected through self-described steps. Those are mutually exclusive claims. And so what they're really after is simply a power grab.
Yes.
This is a power-hungry movement. It's laid bare, it's obvious to anyone paying attention. There's no solution to this. Trust us. Don't question how we measure it. And also, we're going to put in a race czar. That's one of their, that was one of their recommendations, by the way, a race ombudsman. Now, I have no idea what their motivations were, but I'm saying in my aforementioned statement there that that's a general motivation that I see on the left regarding these matters. Imagine that. Imagine a race ombudsman at every institute in America and federally at the level of the National Association. Here's another irony. These are subjective points, questions and survey items. And so say a candidate believes that he or she has been the victim of racism or something like that and goes to a race czar, race ombudsman. Wouldn't the race ombudsman then need to use objective criteria to adjudicate that matter? So what then is the basis for the backlash against people like me who are calling for objectivity in the very report? It's another layer of imbecilic irony.
So they really push for revolutionary radicalism, and that is what they're possibly going to get. I mean, the field is being flooded by anti-racist zealots, and I do see that it's only a matter of time until the shakeup is going to lead to an objectively observed schism within psychoanalysis, and we'll probably have something like psychoanalysis on one hand, and I don't know, Antifa analysis on the other. and let me tell you, I mean, within what I call as analysis and their sensitivity to even the slightest deviations from what is decided to be orthodoxy, and also this continuous flickering of orthodoxy. Then we refer to BIPOC people as BIPOC, and then to them as black people, and then to POC people. I mean, you can't keep up with the changing of terms to and fro. Nothing as radical and as anaphylactic as such a grouping would be possible to survive. They will start turning against each other, and it's going to be a bloodfest. So I think the sooner psychoanalysis can fragment into proper psychoanalysis and anti-analysis, the better.
I agree with you entirely.
Yeah.
Entirely. And by the way, I don't know if either of you caught the recent episode on Joe Rogan and also on Jordan Peterson with Abigail Schreier. She's written a new book. I think it's called Bad Treatment, and it's it's a very pointed takedown of the psychotherapy field writ large. She's correct on one level. I respect her a lot. She does have a rather a phase one kind of system one analysis. That's what Kahneman would criticize her for. But she's generally right. And she's reacting to all of this, a completely woke, progressive kind of therapy that ingratiated itself to overly empathic mothers starting in the 1990s who babied their kids and turned the United States into an infantile nation. And therapy became a profession that essentially tried to achieve the economic patronage of those mothers. And that shaped the field into this kind of narcissistic reification of people's subjective experiences. And Schreier has written a book and has, again, been on Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. And those two podcasts alone, I think you could probably make an empirical study where peak listenership to those two episodes with her occurred, and then a subsequent decline in the overall usage of psychotherapy, such as the reach of Joe Rogan. And it's, there's a real tide shift.
Yes.
And she's remarking on it.
Right.
Our discussion today is one of the reasons she probably wrote that book. This is nonsense. This is complete nonsense. And the psychotherapy field has been turned into a laughingstock. That's one of the more serious objections I have. It actually makes me angry. It takes me out of sarcasm into anger. Things like this, what we're discussing, really have tarnished a profession that I've spent a good portion of my life training for, as have both of you. Pulled the rug out, the rug of seriousness and of respect out from under all professions, all of the allied mental health professions. And for that, those of you watching who are in training, good luck to you.
I loved teaching. That was my heart. It was that's where everything about psychotherapy and everything I loved about it the most was the teaching component. So I was very angry that got ripped from underneath me, but there was a choice that I had to make, which was I'm going to stay and participate in all of this, and I'm going to infuse this in my classroom just because I want to teach, or I'm going to actually look and say, I literally couldn't do it anymore. I actually could not get the words. I couldn't utter the words anymore in my classroom. And that's where that change had to happen, where I had to leave, and it just had to be this way, unfortunately. And when I resigned, I told them the reason, and the answer was, well, a lot of professors feel like you do, Christine, but we got to do something about diversity. So this is what we're doing. That was the answer. I mean, it was a very, I had almost wished that I had been cussed out, to be honest with you.
That would actually have a cathartic conflict. A broad question that is facing America right now is, can the two sides, so to speak, however you define them, can they relate? Can they coexist? And I'm still working that out. I think the people, the general people in our society who we're talking about, who have these sentiments on race and implicit racism, implicit bias, and so forth. And I think they're probably the same people who would also say an individual can identify as a plural, right? that an individual person can call him or herself a they. Once you're in that land, how do you make sense? You're no longer in the realm of reasonable discourse. So what would be the point?
Look, it's always good psychoanalytic practice to think about possible conciliation or reconciliation. It's always good to work with that ambivalent stance. But this becomes increasingly impossible to maintain, especially if you think about the extent of destruction such resentment discourses, not only destruction, but also demoralization, such resentment discourses have on huge institutions. And at some point, look, it is one thing to say, I have an infant, and this infant resorts to very destructive attacks on me as their parent. But I take these toxic attacks, I detoxify them, I attune to my infant. And in that way, the infant evolves from beta elements to alpha elements to preconcepts and to concepts, etc. And we integrate that infant's psychology. But we know it is a different ball game when that infant grows up to, say, a 24-year-old and acts out the level of aggression and destruction that fits the strength and intelligence of a 24-year-old. Because then we walk into the realm of criminality to such an extent that that 24-year-old could actually really kill me. And then our techniques need to be a bit different. And I think this is a similar situation with psychoanalysis and Antifa analysis, that the level of destruction is so total, and the gangrene of such resentment ideology is so destructive that I don't think they could coexist in one space.
I agree.
That doesn't mean the one should exist and the other one should not exist, or vice versa. That's what I'm saying. In the name of freedom, let's allow reality to be the ultimate adjudicator. Psychoanalysis, you go your way. Antifa analysis, you go yours. You see your patients, you do what you consider to be a practice of mental health. The rest of us will do something else. We won't interfere. Let's see how evolution and survival of the fittest will discriminate or distinguish between who will survive and who will not.
You're playing by the Marquis of Queensberry rules. Okay? They're not. They will not let you go your way and live life as you see fit.
Right.
So your credo is fine, but it's not a coda, because they're going to carry on the fight. They're not content to let you go think the way you want to think and do what you want to do. They're not into freedom.
I think this is worth an episode on its own, and I think we will explore it maybe in a different episode. The future of psychoanalysis. What do we envision?
Yep.
What might be the possible obstacles and what not? And look, there's a reason why we said, Lucas, and we again, we're very thankful for you to be on our team and to help us think critically, and also to critically reflect, critical in the small c sense of the word. But there was a reason why we said that let's conclude the discussion, because everything about this is so repetitive. It's like having a huge, I remember studying organic chemistry. You have to synthesize something, but if you make a mistake in your organic structures and your formulas up there, everything downstream will be mistaken. And if you make the consistent error over and over and over again, everything downstream will be consistently in error. I think right from the beginning, this report was in major error. Their doctrinal assumption of the ubiquity of systemic racism, their standpoint epistemology, no caution due to self-selection bias when they sent out the invitation to participate during a time of external threat, namely the death of George Floyd. In other words, during a time of narcissistic large group regression, where at a time around COVID, after the Trump Biden mess. And then there was so much going on in America. And then these people decided, okay, it's time to capitalize on this instability. No control of in-group bias, no exploration of alternative interpretation, and then this skewed approach of having the most uncharitable interpretation of statistics so as to confirm, affirm a predetermined outcome anyway. I mean, this is one flawed waste of resources that I would never have imagined psychoanalysis would subject itself to.
I think Mills quoted it at over 200,000 spent on this membership dues for an organization that I think has what, maybe 7 million total. I'm grasping at numbers there. Jaco, maybe we could talk at some point again, and I guess I would just have to be considered a co-host at that point. But you know, the issue of walking your separate way and forming your own institution and your own group and your own consortium. As I said, you're playing by Marquis of Queensberry rules. They're not, generally the left is not satisfied with that. And we know this because they're coming after our licensure bodies and they're implementing their thoughts on race and gender in particular into our very requirements for professional conduct. So you can walk away, but yeah, what are you walking into?
We'll discuss that in the next episode. Any last thoughts, Christine?
No.
Everyone in training, keep your head up, and you know, you can make the profession better. You can listen to CTA, you can listen to Real Clear podcast, and you can also fraternize with your colleagues right out loud so that the tide starts to turn. I don't think this movement that we're decrying here has won. We're evidence of that. There are others, and I think it can be turned around.
And CTA is really starting to develop their peer pre-licensure supervision / consult groups specifically for this reason. So keep an eye on where we are with the development of those groups, and hopefully those will be helpful, and you'll find some like-minded people there as well.
The spirit that will protect true healing will help us through this difficult time. I'm convinced of that. There's just no other way. Thank you very much, Lucas. Take care.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, guys.